Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of Climate Comrades, a brand new series from the Purple Patch podcast. Uh, Tonight we have with us Mr. Timothy Damon, and before we begin anything, I would like to introduce him. So, Tim is founder and president of Global Youth Development Institute, an internationally focused NGO with the mission to empower youth as leaders for climate and sustainability actions. He has deep experience in climate diplomacy, youth engagement, and action for climate empowerment from more than 12 years of experience and involvement around the UNFCCC process. And that spans various roles both as a member of civil society and as an ACE negotiator and advisor for several parties and groups. He holds an MSc in climate change and international development from University of East Anglia and a BA in law and policy with economics minor from Dickinson University. So firstly, welcome, Tim. We have begun a brand new series as Climate Comrades, basically creating a niche for ourselves in the sector. So firstly, I would just like to ask you, how does it feel, with years of experience in meeting like-minded people, doing what you do?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't still be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for a lot of the people I've met along the way. We can't solve the climate crisis without working together, and
Right,
you need
exactly.
people to work with. And happy that you're expanding, right? We need more people raising awareness about these issues. So congratulations, and my pleasure to be here for the first session.
Thank you so much. So tell us something about your journey, how it began, and basically what inspired you to, pursue climate action.
Well, my story might be a little bit less of the typical one for those who are working in climate and environment. I didn't even get any climate change education at all in my K-12 curriculum. And to say that now here, I'm not only dating myself of when I was in school, but also showing the contrast of we have made some progress today. That is actually a course that at least a lot more
Yes.
people are getting now. But, you know, I still, from growing up in the rural countryside of Ohio here in the States, it was very typical. The education system as a whole was not as competitive as it would be in a lot of more developed areas of the country. And I still, though, did get that connection to the environment. So even though my formal education was deficient in that area, by playing outside, having woods and a pond and a creek in the backyard and, lots of cool critters to go and figure out which ones it's safe to pick up and which ones it isn't, and to ask all those questions about the world. How did all this come into being, and what's our relationship to it? It was all very fundamental to me growing up, and also as is relevant for today, where we see that climate change can be a very politicized topic as well. It's worth noting that coming from that rural area as well, it was more politically conservative, but I was able to also get some exposure to the fact that there's a bigger world outside of where my hometown was. And sort of take on a viewpoint between the both of my parents, one of whom was from the rural area here in Ohio and had grown up on the more conservative end of the American spectrum. But my mother moved here to Ohio from Boston, Massachusetts. And so she came from the very
Oh,
liberal end of the spectrum and settled here, where I then grew up here. And so, I feel this tension of like, I'm more in the middle than a lot of the other people, or at least in the mainstream of the politics. So that's also an interesting dynamic when it comes to how we try to communicate climate change and to reach people who are skeptical of it or just outright denying it. We need everyone on board ultimately.
absolutely. I remember for me, it was basically, so my favorite subject, one of my favorite subject was environmental science, but it was more of a theory than practical, and I remember in ninth grade we used to have these 3 days retreat in the school itself, but it was basically as a form of self development of what you can see in the nature, and how you can interpret nature in what you feel. That was one of the most how do I put it, that was one of the most fascinating experience for me in my school curriculum. But again, in college, basically my graduation has nothing to do with climate change, and I'm more from a technical background. So yeah, the whole I just did my engineering because my parents wanted me to. I have absolutely no interest in engineering whatsoever. So anyway, um, so was there a specific incident in your life that made you go from generally caring about the environment to wanting to work towards it?
Well, there is, and it's kind of a funny story. So, having not gotten exposed to any environmental education in K-12, it wasn't until I then went and started my undergraduate studies, and I accidentally picked one of the top-ranked institutions in the United States for sustainability, Dickinson, and but I didn't even know they had those programs. They had very good study abroad programs. I already knew by this point I was interested in international affairs or relations, so that's what drew me to them. And then I also had become involved in the student government, still nothing to do with sustainability, but in a nutshell, I had done very well in my first year at Dickinson in the student senate, and they wanted to have me back, but I hadn't succeeded in winning an election to be reelected to stay in the Senate. So the outgoing command from the outgoing student Senate president to the new one had been get him back on the student Senate. And so when the next semester rolled around and started, it turned out they had a vacancy for the environmental liaison position. No one wanted to be the environmental liaison apparently. And I didn't exactly know what it would entail, but I thought, okay, that sounds cool. I'll go for that. And then that was what really pulled me into starting to work practically on environmental issues, because that's where I got into campus sustainability. So addressing issues of how do we make the infrastructure of the campus more sustainable. We didn't have enough bike racks. The local community didn't have bike lanes, and those were able to be added. How do you green the electrical production of the campus? Because Dickinson was really trying to be very progressive on this, and this culminated not only in addressing the curriculum aspects, mainstreaming sustainability across all the different degree courses, so that even if you would have been studying engineering at Dickinson, you still would have had to, fulfill your core requirement of at least one sustainability course, for example, or they would have integrated it in some way into the engineering. These are things we need to do from a climate education standpoint, but also making recommendations on how the college could become carbon neutral by 2020. And ultimately, they succeeded in doing that. So it was just that happy accident that really brought me into saying, there's practical ways that I could work toward the environment. And you could say I caught the climate change bug, so to speak, wanting to work on that.
So for us, basically, I think that was, we used to have some social activities in schools and colleges. But, given the whole mentality and the kind of activities that you can do, most of it only focused around tree plantation, which, according to me, is basically not the only way to go about it, but it's the easiest, we can say. Um, it kind of sort of sparked an interest in me as well, that I wanted to pursue environmental sector. So that is when I think I decided to go for CSR, basically, because it, aligned with a little bit with governance as well. And now I can say I practically love my job, love what I do. My career graph is totally all over the place. So tell us something about your ACE and Yango journey, how it started, and how did this lead you to get involved in the UNFCCC process?
Well, again, I really had a very happy accident selecting Dickinson, because it turned out the person they hired to be the director for the Office of Campus Sustainability had also been one of the lead authors for Working Group 2 of the IPCC for their report that they shared in the Peace Prize with Al Gore and all that. And so he was very familiar with the UNFCCC process. And as I would have now in his place, if I settled down somewhere to be a professor, I'd want to take students there and use it as a teaching opportunity. So he actually designed, teamed up with a couple other professors and gave us this global climate change Africa mosaic. Because the COP this year, we're referring to COP 17, so this is in South Africa. And so all of my coursework for that whole semester was somehow related to climate change as part of this package. So he was teaching the course on the economics and politics of climate change. They brought on one of the science faculty to teach us, the climate science fundamentals. And then they brought someone from the anthropology department to teach us about the history of people in Africa with a focus on the Zulu people from, KwaZulu-Natal, which is where Durban is, which is where the conference was going to be. So I was very happy to sign up to that program, and they took us there then to COP 17 to do research interviews. And of course, I discovered there, oh, wait, there's a lot of young people from around the world. There's this thing called Youngo, this youth NGO's constituency. This is cool. And, then that would see me, connect up with a US based youth organization that was sending delegations each year. This also prompted me to pursue my master's, in fact. Climate change international development. Up to this point, I really only had the more climate change aspect. And I was still very interested in human rights and development and being globally aware. But besides going to the conference, they took us afterwards to the Valley of a Thousand Hills area there in South Africa. So it's a very rural and less developed area. And we did some volunteer work at a children's village and so forth. And so from that experience, I was finally able to, take the development challenge, the global inequalities question from this theoretical thing that you study and and you see the statistics to actually putting faces on it and seeing that. And so from there, I was like, okay, I can't only work on climate change. I need to also work on development, and we need to somehow juggle these two competing priorities. But then, yeah, that is what brought me then into discovering Youngo and starting that whole journey.
And moving to what you do today, like you are the founder and president of Global Youth Development Institute. How did that journey come about?
Well, as I mentioned, they're starting out getting involved in Youngo and the process. At that point in time, we needed to get a global agreement, which became the Paris Agreement. Durban was that conference where they agreed to agree in the funny way that we refer to that. And so at that point, I wasn't working on ACE, but was trying to get intergenerational equity included, get the Paris Agreement to be strong from a youth standpoint. So it was I learned that ACE was a topic, but it was secondary. And then it was really once we got the Paris Agreement, it's like, okay, so now we have the agreement. Now what? Oh, well, we need to implement it. And at this point, ACE to me was the most logical area for me to work on. I had already, during my earlier years of schooling, I had done a lot of peer tutoring. So I had already this interest in education. Um, and I had seen just that, it's one thing to agree to all these wonderful actions that we need to take and set all these goals in the Paris Agreement and so forth. But all the ways that you implement them, a lot of that comes down to these elements of ACE, which for those who aren't familiar, when we talk about action for climate empowerment, we're referring to 6 things. That's education, training, public participation, access to information, awareness raising, and then international cooperation on those 5 areas between countries. And, let me give a couple concrete examples on that. suppose you say, all right, we're going to reduce our emissions by, getting people to change their behaviors to consume less electricity. Well, you're going to need an awareness campaign to do that so that people actually know how to do that. Suppose you're going to make your community more resilient, be better able to adapt to climate change. Well, they're going to need to understand how climate change is going to impact them. These communities need to be able to participate in the decisions that their governments are taking about climate change. Otherwise, they're being marginalized from that process. So, you know, yeah, that's what led me into it, and why it really felt that, hey, this is a these are the tools by which we actually solve climate change to a large extent. Are we training engineers who actually understand climate change, can give us better renewable energy technologies? Like all of that, somehow it's training, education, awareness, participation, information.
So, do you think it's actually possible to achieve these goals by 2030, like in Paris Agreement? Like, do you think it's
Well,
actually kind of feasible, given the whole, witnessing what kind of impacts that we have in climate change?
Well, it becomes a tricky question because there's what is possible to achieve from a scientific standpoint, and then there's what is possible to achieve from a political standpoint. The process takes a lot of criticism for how long it's taken to get to where we are, in the diplomacy. And we keep getting louder and louder warnings from the science. And, so I mean, I think from a scientific standpoint, yes, we could, if we had the political will today, probably still implement enough emissions reductions and so forth that we could achieve those goals. But politically, will we actually do that? Will we mobilize the resources? Will we, make some of the trade-offs in the short term that are necessary for that, for the long-term survival of our species? That's where it becomes trickier.
Because it's actually something to think about. We are already 6 years to the target, and um, witnessing certain things like just a couple of years ago, my hometown, which never had any kind of climatic disaster to say, it actually got flooded all in the name of so-called development. And that got me thinking, are we really working towards it, or are we exploiting the planet even more? you know this is something um, that made me question what kind of people we are electing to lead, what kind of people we are choosing to lead us. So I mean, luckily there wasn't much damage, but still it was something really unpredictable, to say.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's the thing, is that even if we leave aside climate change and we look in the broader environmental context, so much of what we're doing is just very destructive. And, we as humans, our survival depends upon the health of the environment. We're not somehow separate from the environment and, immune to whatever's happening. And, that is that fundamental tension between the environment and development. Uh, it's already there that we're consuming more resources per year than the earth can provide in the space of a year. And that date keeps moving earlier and earlier in the year, when they say, oh well, already by the middle of March we've consumed a year's worth of natural rates of resources. um, so yeah, it's a very challenging situation we've put ourselves in as humans. But going back to what you said about who we put in charge, you know, we need our leaders to be people that are going to be bold and try to work on tackling these challenges. But of course, there's political reasons that's not happening. It's, if you're only worried about getting reelected, you don't want to maybe impose stronger policies on the people because those policies will be unpopular and you won't get
Right.
reelected. Or the influence of money in politics. Here in the United States, the big companies, they're spending a lot of money to support our political process, and so our politicians, many of them are unsurprisingly, trying to act in the interests of those big companies rather than, the rest of the people. So we, in a way, in order to solve climate change, we need to kind of solve some of these deeper political and, structural governmental problems that we have that are in general, making it harder to pass the kinds of policies that we need. And that's not true only of climate change, but if you look at wider social issues and things like that, are the government representatives representing us, the people, or are they representing someone else's interests?
Exactly. Um, like you said, we are exploiting a year's worth of resources right in the middle of March, for example. Um, I would like to take up an example of electric cars. Like, it is said to be good for environment, but is it really? Because ultimately, if you are building a lithium ion electric car, you are extracting lithium, right? That is not, and basically, electric cars are lot more expensive to manufacture. So do you think there is research going on in this kind of debate that uh, goes on around the world? Like, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, electric cars are a good example of where something that sounds positive for the environment and is positive in one respect, you need to not only look at from one narrow lens, but you need to look at holistically, right? So, okay, yes, an electric car will not produce emissions, and that's a good thing. But you still have to build the electric car. Is
Exactly.
that going to emissions? In order to build the electric car, you do need to gather the resources to build it. What are the emissions from that? What are the environmental impacts from that? And we know that mining in general, but especially for a lot of these more rare earth metals, can also be very environmentally destructive and impact communities that are around it. So, it's easy to sort of latch on to some of these solutions like electric cars, reusable dishware and things like that. Um, but you're still somehow consuming energy and having an impact. And, I don't have the numbers, and I like to always be very careful, to have numbers and research if I'm going to say something. So I'll just state I don't have numbers for this, but there was recently an article that was talking about specifically for electric cars that it takes several years at least of using that electric car before the amount of emissions that you have saved by not producing them as you drive starts to balance out with and then become a net positive for the emissions associated with building the car. So, that becomes like you can do that research, you can do those numbers, but it requires people to think in that broader sense and to realize, okay, maybe there's more to it than just a car that doesn't emit anything is a better car. And of course, you're making emissions to produce a regular car as well. So, yeah, it becomes a lot of, data and numbers that you can crunch, but just there's too much of a saying, oh, this doing this one renewable thing somehow makes us no longer have any impacts. And that's not the case. Humans will always, by existing, we will create impacts on the environment that we need to take into account. There's no easy way out of that, as much as people would like there to be that easy way out of it.
So, what apart from human intervention do you think is, the cause for climate action? Like the chain reaction we were talking about the other day. What else do you think causes the environment to degrade so much that there is a hole in the ozone layer now?
Well, to make sure I'm understanding, the question, it's, like other than human
Yes.
activities, what
Yeah.
is it that's, driving? And yeah, this is a really important question because I think part of the difficulty that we're having in getting more people to be on board with climate change action is the communication around this very question has not been as good as it needed to be. You know, if we look back over the history of our planet, as best as we can tell from what science can inform us about how the planet used to be, the climate has changed a lot just by nature before humans were even here, right? The climate that dinosaurs lived in was very different from the climate that we're in now. There's the theoretical snowball Earth that people may have heard of, where much of the planet may actually have been very frozen. And of course, we know we've gone back and forth in our more recent times with the ice age cycle. You get 100,000-ish or so years of ice age, then you warm up for about 10,000 years, and then you go back down. But the key thing is the time frame over which all of those changes were happening was very long. It is longer than humans have been here. It is many times longer than humans have been here. And so what the change we're seeing right now of the warming, the increase in global mean temperature is definitely our fault because it's happening way faster than anything that nature has shown us that it does. Um, Even when a lot of volcanic eruptions happen and those put sulfates into the atmosphere, and those have a cooling effect because they're deflecting more of the solar radiation. Even those are a more short-lived event. It onsets, and this is maybe partly what was responsible, they think, for the little ice age that Europe experienced kind of in the Middle Ages. Um, and along with this, like even plate tectonics will affect this because that affects ocean currents. So before the North America and the South America, pushed together where Panama is, there was an ocean current that was able to flow through there. And when the land closed off that channel for the water, the ocean currents had to adapt and change. And then that also affected the climate because we're getting heated up at the equator, right? More of the
Right.
sun's energy is being focused there, and nature is all about trying to have equilibrium. So that energy wants to go to where there's less energy, which is toward the poles, and that's why you get the flow of water, from the equator up into the Arctic and all the things that are going on. So, it's yes, nature changes the climate on its own, even the position of the sun relative to the earth. There's a lot of fascinating cycles you can study if you dig into this. And I will give the disclaimer, I'm not a climate scientist. I have studied climate change, but I will not at all claim that I'm the climate scientist. So there are better people to answer and explain all of this. But I would try to dispel, a lot of the misconceptions that are out there, even the confusion between climate versus weather. Just because it's snowing outside and it's cold doesn't mean that global warming isn't a thing, because we're talking about the average temperature of the entire planet versus the local temperature at a specific place at a specific time. Yeah.
So, do you think we will still be able to limit to 1.5 degrees by the end of 2050, or like what will be the repercussions if that 1.5 moves to 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees? What kind of repercussions do you think humans will face if we don't act on it soon?
Well, they're not good, in short. Again, there's, the IPCC and, the climate scientists, they've put out a lot of good research materials on this. So I will give, a more less technical explanation of it. And there's a range of scenarios. In general, the warmer we go, the worse it's going to get. And already today, we have a lot of warming that's locked into the system because there's a lag time between when we put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and when they have their full effect in terms of trapping the heat. Because it takes time of the sun hitting the earth every single day with heat for that to slowly build up in response to the gases that we've put in the atmosphere. So even if we stopped all emissions today, there would still be at least a little bit more warming that was going to happen. Um, And the biggest thing, I've already seen this in my own life. So when I was little and growing up, winter was an actual season, right? For us, we're supposed to have four distinct seasons and, a summer and a winter, and you get a transition on either end between those two. Um, and now we barely get any snow. It's very rare to have, a white Christmas, for example, which is something, we over here talk about a lot. And yet when we do still get snow, it's almost always in more of a blizzard or a bigger amount. So it's more disruptive when it happens. So it's not that, a warmer world means that you might not still get extreme cold events. In fact, in recent years, we've had quite a number of these polar vortexes or other very hyperbolic names that the Weather Channel would give to these things over here. You're like, watch out, everyone! The polar vortex is coming. The Gulf Stream is going to come down from Canada and bring really cold temperatures across the United States. But we're going to see more extremes. We're going to see more unpredictability. So the climate that you were used to having um, is not going to be the same behavior that you're seeing. So we're more likely to have more droughts and more floods, both. Because when you do get rain, you're probably going to get a greater quantity of it. And you'll have more intense periods of not having it. Storms, hurricanes, cyclones. If you're heating up the water, then you're putting more energy into the system, which means there's more moisture, more heat to build up a stronger hurricane or cyclone, and the frequency of them should increase. And we've also seen this. You don't need to be the climate scientist to say, why are my insurance premiums going up and up and up faster than they ever have if I live in Florida or, the East Coast of the United States? Oh, it's Katrina. It's, it's all these, half dozen hurricanes that have all been happening, you know. And of course, we see also on the other side of the world, I mean, the poor Philippines keeps getting clobbered again and again, Bangladesh, India. I mean, like, so you also you see like, were there always this many cyclones? Well, welcome to the future of climate change. Those will just be more frequent and get worse over time. And as well, just I mentioned already droughts and floods and so forth, but and then that of course, well, why does any of that matter? Is it just inconvenient? No, like we need to grow food. We want to eat. Farmers need to be able to depend upon the climate. You need the weather to do a certain thing at a certain time of the year, or your crops get destroyed, right? So all of this has knock-on impacts for human survival and human activities. And so in the worst case kind of scenario, it's not going to be a very nice world to live in. Um, all the coastal areas, coastal cities, psh, those are underwater from sea level rise. I joke, I live here in Ohio, and for those not familiar with US geography, that's kind of in the Midwest. So it's under the Great Lakes there. And I joke that Ohio is going to be one of the places that the United States will get its climate refugees because you have all the big population centers on the East Coast, New York City, DC, etc. Most of Florida will go underwater. So where are those people going to go? Well, they're going to go east. Then you go out to the Western United States where it's already dry. They've never had enough water even to begin with. And it just keeps getting worse. And the wildfires are worse. And the drought is worse. Where are they going to go when their whole place is a dust bowl? They're going to go east. Where are they going to meet up? In Ohio. So, and the point is like no country, will be immune to the effects of climate change.
Right, but I think we are already seeing the repercussions of the unpredictability of the weathers. Even in India, we get the summer rains and winter heats, like like I mentioned to you. So, witnessing the impacts we are having of climate change, what are we hoping for in the next few years, and what do you think is, stopping us from going forward?
Yeah, that's also a really good and important question. So, you know, if I take us back to thinking about, for example, the UNFCCC process, the climate negotiations, the efforts between all the countries of the world to try to save us from what we were just talking about there. Um, the thing that really is holding us back is that fundamentally what we see is that countries are still very much entrenched in pursuing their own national interest in the short term. And so they're trying to figure out how to work together, but that process is still political and it still is part of the wider geopolitics that are happening. And some of the specific issues we see within that, you know, developed countries have been consistently and are still reluctant to actually provide climate finance. There's the promises of, $100 billion per year and, other funds, there's the Green Climate Fund, there's the Adaptation Fund, we have all these funds. We're now making a loss and damage fund, which is a good news. That's good news. Took too long to get there, but okay, good, better late than never. But where's the money? The money has been noticeably lacking, deficient, not enough. And, it's probably the single biggest tension that we see in these negotiations is over the money. And, uh, you know, understandably, developed countries don't want to, spend the money. But then these emissions don't respect borders, right? So if you can't also ask developing countries to reduce their emissions, um, just for the sake of climate, they still need to be able to develop and meet the needs of their people. And if coal is the cheapest energy for them to use to actually electrify their country and give people all the benefits of development, and it would be more expensive for them to use renewables. And they're saying, please, developed countries, give us some money to, cover that for us. Um, you know, that ultimately is a reasonable request for them to make. And if you don't support them to do that and they keep doing coal plants, then we're all in trouble. So figuring out how to balance these, geopolitics, it's kind of like each country is, you know, out just for themselves in a sense. And I'm going to make a connection here. When it came to the Cold War and nuclear proliferation and all of that, we had the phrase mutually assured destruction, right? That if any one country would use their nuclear weapons, and then of course the other country does, we're all dead, right? Well, that's kind of, I'm going to apply this term now to climate change and say that if the countries of the world don't actually figure out how to work together on climate change, this is also a mutually assured destruction because no amount of money is going to save the developed countries from that worst case scenario. Um, but of course, we also see, it's not only developed countries that are playing the politics. For example, China. China's economy in 1992 was a lot less than it is today. Their emissions were a lot less. And so China at that time was categorized as, was not categorized as a developed country. And so they don't have to do a lot of the things that developed countries do.